Hello, and welcome to Sceptics Corner, or welcome back to Sceptics Corner if you've been before. My name's Rory. I'm the minister of the Methodist Church in Haxby and Wigginton and Central Methodist Church in York. And this is the fifth session of Sceptics Corner, where we've been systematically looking over the last 4 weeks, and will do for some time, at a number of things that are believed within the Christian faith, or are parts of some people's faith, or are somehow just assumed within the faith that leave me and many other people with questions about what they say about God, about ourselves, about life, the universe, and everything. We're really asking how things knit together and how they make sense, and coming at belief or faith or experience or any of those things with a degree of skepticism is a good thing to do, because it means we don't just accept and receive everything that comes our way, either through our own lives or other people's, but that we spend some time asking some questions about, as I said before, how things fit together and whether our faith is coherent. And if even the things that the church seems to have as its mainline beliefs actually make sense to us, which is an important thing if we're going to be asked as part of being a person of faith to follow Jesus, lay down our lives. It needs to be something that seems worthwhile, something that seems sensible, something that seems coherent. So we've looked at a number of things over the weeks, and they've sort of built on each other, and I won't go back and do a précis of all of those. They're all on the church's YouTube channel. But the sessions do build on each other, so some of what I say today is shaped by questions we've wrestled with in some ways in weeks before. Today, well, another little topic, heaven and hell. Jean-Paul Sartre said once, as part of a play that he wrote, hell is other people. And he had to spend some time after that explaining exactly what he meant, because the assumption that he was simply saying that other people are awful is not what he meant at all. But you can look that up if you'd like to. We live with largely caricatured ideas of heaven and hell. If you ask people who are Christian what it means to be saved, they will often say that somehow being saved by the life and works and perhaps death and resurrection of Jesus, that ultimately is about being saved eternally into the presence of God in terms of heaven, saved from judgment that might send them in some way to eternal suffering in hell, that in some ways being saved is either a reward or an escape from the consequences of judgment. Now, I want to say that today I'm not really going to talk about judgment that much. There is another conversation to have, which might be next week's, about our understanding of God's judgment and how that fits into the experience of death, and also then our ideas about final judgment, about the second coming of Jesus, and about that moment when some people believe the Bible points us towards an event that is either tomorrow or in the future, depending on who you ask, where God will finally reveal God's magnificence and power to the world, and all will be judged in a way that is going to be good news for some, not so great news for others. But we live with these caricature ideas of heaven and hell. Heaven as a sort of a beautiful, light, white place full of clean clothing and little angels, and I know I'm overstating the caricature, but for many people their idea of heaven is some kind of static arrival into perfect purity and perfect welcome and perfect love and everything being perfect. Whereas hell is largely dark, fiery. Interestingly, the images given to us by artists over the years are often of heaven being a place where people are beautifully clothed, and hell being a place where people are painfully naked. Again, tapping into that whole bodily shame idea. But hell is generally red. It's full of strange, always male figures, it would seem, even though they don't seem to have genitalia, who have pointy sticks or sort of tridents and horns on their heads and forked and tails with little points on the end, and they prod people and make sure that they're having a thoroughly miserable time. Well, none of those images are actually very helpful, because they are quite childish, really. They are, none of them satisfies the great questions we have about the meaning of human existence, or the mystery of life, the fact of death, and the place of death and relationship in the whole of the cosmos, in the whole of our understanding of the way that everything works together. I want to begin by saying something about time, because there are some philosophers and theologians who would even say that any conversation about what the afterlife might be like is a waste of time. They might not use that strong language, but essentially that it is philosophically or theologically meaningless, because our own experience is so bound by our experience of the passing of time that we can't imagine the experience of something that is momentarily eternal, that is not ongoing in the way that we might think about today, tomorrow, and all the days forever and ever, but that is somehow completely devoid of that experience of the passing of time. So part of our conversation today, really, and again, it's going to be about half an hour, so just dipping our toes into the waters of ideas and thoughts about heaven and hell, is not so much about what heaven and hell might be like, although I will touch on that a bit, but more whether they make sense and how they make sense, and what we make of the idea of there being these separate physical or spiritual realms of experience beyond death that people find themselves in. Ultimately, we're talking about the afterlife, and it's important to look back into the scriptures and into both Jewish and Christian tradition and Jewish and Christian teaching when it comes to understanding something of what we think heaven and hell might mean, and what words are used in the Bible and how they make sense to us today. So in Judaism, in the Jewish faith, in the whole of the Old Testament, which is the Hebrew scriptures, there is really no early concept of an afterlife. There's no clear concept of even any kind of life after death. But that in the Hellenistic period, in the period from about 300 BC, a little bit before then, 300 BC until about 30 years before the birth of Christ, if we use the calendar we have now, crudely, under enormous Greek influence, it seems that the Jewish people and the Jewish faith takes on, as it has in other ways, aspects of other mythologies, traditions, and beliefs from the cultures that it's surrounded by. In exile, in Babylonia, with a Mesopotamian influence, with various influences, out of Egypt, out of Greece, out of all kinds of places over the years. The Jewish faith adopts and modifies and it would argue, I suppose, progresses into some of the ideas that we find much more concretely in the faith we express today, but maybe even not as clearly in the New Testament as we might think. But it's important to say that in Judaism, especially in the Hebrew scriptures, until and there are only a tiny handful of mentions of anything that might suggest an afterlife. There are a couple of words that get used in the original languages that get used again and again. One of those is Sheol. And the question is about whether these are physical spaces, spiritual spaces, not sure. But Sheol really means little more than a place of darkness to which all the dead go. I guess a resting place. A place of darkness to which all the dead go. And the term Hades is much the same in its meaning. A place of darkness to which all the dead go. There's no judgment necessarily involved in that. It is simply the fact of after you dying, somehow some part of you continuing almost inanimately in some place. And then there's Gehenna, which is a literal place, is a small valley in Jerusalem, and it gets used to describe particularly a place where those who have fallen short of God's mark in some way might go after they died. Gehenna as a literal place was a place of child sacrifice by some of the early Judean kings, the kings of Judah. And it was believed to be cursed. It was believed to be an evil place, a place that was somehow dirty, untouchable, unclean. Gehenna. But Gehenna is a physical place, and so when people talk about Gehenna, they would be referring to, symbolically perhaps, what they meant in the use of that word. But Gehenna would be known. And that place or variations of it come up again and again. In the Christian scriptures, in the New Testament, we find, certainly when we're thinking about hell, we find the word Hades returning. Hades as the place of the dead. Hades literally meaning, in some cases, the grave. And the idea that all go there. Hades is not a place where judgment is exercised necessarily. It is a place where all the dead go. And again, the returning to Gehenna. Gehenna, which is in New Testament times the rubbish dump. It is the rubbish dump. It is the place where people go, where they burn their rubbish. It is a place where there is always a fire burning because there is always rubbish to burn. It is a place where it seems the bodies of those who were considered particularly evil or particularly outside of the Jewish tradition or the Jewish faith or culture, their bodies were dumped to be burnt as part of the rubbish in Gehenna. But again, we're not talking about some spiritual realm. We're talking about a physical place. And Jesus uses Gehenna as an example of the place that you go outside of the love of God. But he uses an example that everybody knows, and he uses an idiom that refers to a place that is well known in the context where he's talking. When it comes to heaven, it becomes a little more, even more opaque, because again, in the Christian scriptures, we don't have in the Bible any clear vision of heaven. The book of Revelation stands on its own as a piece of very perplexing scripture. And some people think it describes a physical realm. Of course, the way they describe it, we go back to the beginning. The way they describe it, it is bound up in the realm of time. God speaks, God acts, things happen, and those things can't happen outside of the passing of time. And so I'm not sure what to make of a literal interpretation of a book like Revelation, or other places where there is just the mention of Enoch, of some of the great prophets, of Elijah being taken up into heaven on a chariot, of Jesus ascending into heaven. We also have this very kind of clear caricatured idea of heaven being up and hell being down. Heaven being somehow in the realms of the stars and the universe, and hell being subterranean, dark and fiery. In the scriptures, heaven is a word that is used, or the word that we translate as heaven is used regularly, but it really talks about two realms. There's the realm of heaven and then the realm of the earth. Two realms in the universe. And God occupies the heavenly realm and we occupy the earthly realm. And there's no clear understanding that human beings have access to the heavenly realm, or that that's something that we even go to after death. Heaven as an afterlife is almost non-existent in the scriptures. It is much more common to understand the whole of scripture as describing all people resting in Sheol or Hades, than to have what is a very developed understanding now in the church's life of a literal spiritual or physical heaven where the souls of the dead go to find eternal rest with God. So the Bible is surprisingly tenuous when it comes to ideas of heaven or hell. The language is limited. It often describes physical places. It borrows parts of its imagery from other faiths and other traditions and other cultures. But we end up, like we do in the church with other things, in a very confident place when it comes to talking about heaven and hell. And we talk about those often, especially in times of tragedy, at funerals and other places like that. Less about hell, more about heaven. Unless you've been to a particularly inappropriately insensitive funeral where the preacher or the minister has decided it was time to save all of you from your own burning in this moment. But we talk about that. We claim what we believe to be God's promise in the words of Jesus in John 14 and other places. We say those things with great confidence, but the Bible is patchy, I guess, is the point. when it comes to thinking about heaven and hell and what they might mean. The New Testament is generally vague. Heaven is a place for the throne of God. If we do go there within the Christian Church's understanding, for some they would see that very much as an experience of a sort of temporary place, that heaven is a kind of waiting room, a kind of holding place for the redeemed before the resurrection of the dead, before Jesus' second coming, before the new heaven and a new earth, before the renewal of everything. Which again, as I said, is another topic which I'll come back to probably next week, because these link together. And others would argue that actually Jesus, in many of the things he says, seems to suggest that heaven or hell are an experience of our present reality, that we are already essentially living one of those two realms in our lives, not because we've been sent there, but because life in the way we've chosen it and it's been chosen for us have placed us in a place where we've perhaps, I don't know, in terms of the combination of our choices and circumstances, found ourselves in a place that either affirms our humanity and welcomes us and loves us, or does many of the things that are opposite to that. That heaven and hell is about relationship with God in the here and now, actually outside of our circumstances. That our experience of eternity is right now. Something very much captured in a lot of Buddhist teaching and a lot of good Christian meditation teaching on the present moment being the real moment, the only moment, that we're really experiencing life, and we're really encountering ourselves and encountering mystery and encountering each other. So we come to ideas about judgment then, about what we mean when we talk about judgment. And as I said, I'll talk a bit more about that next week, but just to say a few things, give a few options in terms of how we understand the transitioning between this life and the afterlife, and what that process, if there's a process, because we can only argue and discuss this in a time-bound way, what that might look like. The Roman Catholic idea of purgatory is not uniquely Catholic, but the idea of this kind of in-between phase where after death we spend some time kind of in some kind of purification, some kind of penance, some kind of confessional, that prepares us for the full glory of the presence of God, is a compassionate idea. It's not rooted in some kind of superstitious desire to bind people to a particular understanding of God, so much as it is an attempt to make sense of the idea of eternal suffering and the compassion of God and the arbitrariness of death, so that those who die in whatever circumstances, with whatever life choices made by them or for them, still have the opportunity to, in a kind of in-between time, prepare themselves, turn to the possibility of God as part of entering into the experience of pure love. Some people say heaven and hell are final. God makes judgment, and when God has made judgment, you go one way or the other way. And those people are often those who are most clear about what heaven and hell are like as physical places and as human experiences, physical experiences, spiritual experiences, and are often most likely to have the most caricatured ideas about white robes, angels and harps, and little pointy stick devils. But there are many people who think that at the point of death, you go one way, you go the other way. And there's been lots of literature, lots of drama, lots of theatre, lots of other things that have tapped into that idea of that moment. We want to make room for the love of God. And for those who struggle with the idea of essentially the arbitrariness of our lives and the arbitrariness of many people's deaths, we want to make room for the possibility beyond death to still be turning to God, to be encountering God, to be converting in a sense to an acceptance of the love of God and the judgment of God and the fact of our human failings. We can mess around with those, we can argue those away, we can debate them and justify our lives before we die. But once we die, we enter into the full truth of God and the full truth of ourselves. And perhaps there's still room for us to be making some choice beyond that. Some would say that that is true, that must be true. That's logically coherent with a God who is love, and a God who leaves us free, touching on previous topics, leaves us free to make our own choices for good or ill, for ourselves or for others. And in the midst of all of that mess and pain and hurt and sometimes death and destruction, for God to simply say, well, I set it all up and set you free, but my standard is still that when you die, you need to have made a particular choice, whatever your circumstances were. And if you haven't made the choice, that's it. You somehow are outside of my love. There are some who'd argue that ultimately all people come to God, that God's love wins in the end, because people can't eventually help but turn to it, because it is not that God insists on that, but because it is so overwhelmingly true as an experience beyond death. The full truth of God and the full truth of our own lives, and the fact of God's love for us being something utterly convincing, something we can't debate or discuss or pretend isn't real, because we are in the presence of ultimate reality and the whole truth, not just of God but of ourselves. No ability to bargain or play the games that we play with our own behaviors and thoughts and attitudes. Some would say, okay, but then that still doesn't seem to suggest that you have the freedom to choose if everyone ultimately comes to God. And so one of the ways that we've tried to understand that would be to say, if God genuinely has given us free will, and if when we die we choose to continue to not accept God's love, then the compassionate thing for God to do would be to annihilate us. Now that's quite a violent word, but it is the right word. To literally snuff us out, to remove us from existence, because that is more compassionate, that is more, I want to say humane, but it's an odd word to use for an act of God. That is the most compassionate and loving thing God can do in the face of continuing rejection. Because the alternative to somehow send us to suffering for eternity is unpalatable to a loving God. Again, your head might be hurting a bit by this point. Go back and rewind, and we'll take a break and return to this conversation. But it is a tricky one to have. Some people say that when we die, we all enter into a kind of dormant state, and that dormant state is waiting for the second coming of Jesus and for the resurrection of the dead in physical form and all of that. I'll talk a bit more about that another time. But I want to share with you one of the images that was given to me by one of my lecturers when I studied theology, and he simply said, and it was a question: what if heaven and hell are the same place? And that when you die, you enter into, as I've said already, you enter into the complete and full and undeniable experience of God and God's love for you, as well as the complete, full and undeniable truth of yourself, all your choices and all your life. And it is not so much that God sits in judgment over you as though there is some kind of courtroom process whereby you pass some bar, you meet some kind of criteria, but that there is just no room for anything but the full truth of God and the full truth of yourself. And so that place is heaven and hell at the same time, because that place is the place of the new or completed experience and understanding of God's love for you, God's holding of you precious, at the same time as it is the complete experience of your shame and your hiddenness and your sin, if we want to use that word, your brokenness, your selfishness, all the things in you that fall short of that love. And that the love makes it painful to be yourself. And so with that kind of image in mind, of course, part of that image, part of what that offers is a picture perhaps of a life after death that still contains progression, still contains learning, growing, confessing, letting go, or maybe just a very painful arriving into the truth of God's love and the fact of being loved, and as part of that being forgiven. So my lecturer said, and again he used the fantastically caricatured examples that we do, the polar opposites. Mother Teresa enters heaven, and who greets her as she walks in? But the gutter people of Calcutta, whom she has bathed and tended and fed and humanized, and it's a wonderful experience for them and for her. Of course, there's more to her than that, but and the alternative is that that Adolf Hitler comes into that experience and knows the full horror of his life, and is welcomed back into welcomed into eternity by not just God but 6 million Jews who are part of his story. It's a compelling image. It's at least worth spending some time with. The fact of trying to imagine the full truth of God's love and the full truth of our own lives with no, I hope you don't find this offensive, but no bullshit, no crap, no ability to argue away anything that is the truth of your life. And that somehow the coming together of those things is a journey into the eternal presence of God. So heaven and hell, the same place, depending a bit like right now on what choices you're making and how you're experiencing life and how you are in touch, in line and in solidarity with the love of God. So we do talk about hope, and hope in the Christian church is often rooted in the idea of death not having the final word. But we don't know what that means. We find ourselves in the realms of mystery very quickly. We look back into Scripture, as I've said, and we find allegorical images. We find very few concrete, specific descriptions of that we could say are reliable, if we're honest, in terms of a doctrine, of a coherent set of beliefs about a literal heaven and a literal hell, physical or spiritual in some way. We find Jesus using allegorical language, talking about a physical place that people know, in talking about those who are outside. The weeping and the wailing and the gnashing of teeth, not necessarily being about people being forced to suffer eternally, but about perhaps the arrival of a sense of regret and aloneness in the consequences of our choices. We don't know. We don't know. So today I wanted to give you some options, give you some starting places for your thinking. Wanted to offer you a compassionate view of the idea of purgatory, of not just in the Catholic Church, but in other faith traditions as well. This idea of a kind of holding place, a purifying place, an in-between place beyond the arbitrariness of life and death and the fullness of God, so that we get to do the work of becoming worthy, or becoming clean, or becoming ready, or just being prepared. I offer you the quite traditional Christian belief, or widely held Christian belief of heaven and hell as final destinations upon the point of death. I offer you the idea of God's of an annihilationism is actually what it's called. The idea of free will being honored by God to the point of us still being able to reject God beyond death. But God, rather than punishing us eternally, because that would be unpalatable to anyone who loved anybody, to essentially euthanize us, snuff us out. It's a compromise. It's an attempt to make sense of things. Universalism, the idea of all, and there's some biblical precedents for that in the way that Revelation describes the final coming together of all of creation. That ultimately, in the end, God wins, and all people are won by love, not by force, not by power, but by love. And within that, the idea of this life and the afterlife being essentially part of the same experience of the truth of God and the truth of ourselves, and the afterlife maybe being a particularly dramatically, powerfully, unavoidably clear experience in every single way possible, with no wriggle room, of the truth of God loving us and the truth of ourselves, and some work to do in the process. So we talked about hope, and I want to say that hope, however we understand heaven and hell, what the danger is that we continue, or we buy into a kind of Western idea of hope as a kind of individual salvation of my soul. That hope is individualized into your life and my life. When I think in the conversations Jesus has about the kingdom of God and the idea of hope, he often is talking about something we do together that is about the legacy of what we create. And so whether we are alive or dead, beyond our death, whether we are in any way present somewhere, somehow, whether we are in any way self-aware, whatever the experience is. But the question isn't so much what have we earned, what have we won, how are we sort of retiring into eternity beyond our hard work, but what legacy have we left that is hopeful in the way we've lived our lives, which perhaps for many people means that they're not that bothered about whether they are alive beyond their deaths, that that's not where their hope is founded, that their hope is founded on the choices they make here today and tomorrow and every day that are about the legacy we choose to leave together for those who come after us. So there you are. Just over half an hour. Barely scratched the surface. Heaven and hell. Hell is other people. As a friend of mine once said in South Africa, heaven is a golf course, an easy golf course. And on every tee and every green there are massive screens with the latest cricket scores. We all do it. We all caricature this great mystery and this great question. What we can't do is be too certain, perhaps, about these things. Or if we are certain about them, to at least acknowledge the limitations of being very certain about them. Because there are many, many questions. And as I said already in a number of ways through this, the Bible is patchy. The Bible is not coherent. And the Bible uses language that doesn't give us permission to simply lift it out and argue that it is factually, historically, and descriptively accurate of some kind of life beyond death, in the best or the worst of what that might look like. So there you are, heaven and hell. Hope that's been interesting. I hope you're not reeling too much, or you don't have a headache now, or if you want to go back and watch it all again, you do that. Again, the Wikipedia pages are a really good starting place. There are lots of places I could send you, but the Wikipedia pages on heaven and hell, and the way that different faiths deal with those ideas, and the way that those ideas cross-pollinate across faiths and cultures is worth having a look at. And if you'd like to join in this coming Thursday evening, that will be Thursday the 2nd of July. If you'd like to join in on the 2nd of July 2020, don't know when you're watching this, for a conversation. We've been about an hour when we've met, then you're welcome to do so. And my contact details are at the end. If you're on the church's mailing list, you'll get the login details for the meeting. But if you're not, just drop me an email or pick up the phone and I'll make sure that you have access to what have been very good, very respectful, very, very interesting and helpful conversations the last 4 weeks with about 8 or 10 people who've wanted to explore these things a little further. So, bless you. And I guess lastly, I just want to say, if anything about the Christian faith has ever left you fearful, and there are many people who've been left fearful by the church, who've been left feeling that they weren't good enough, or somehow didn't believe the right things, or that somehow judgment was coming their way because of who they were, then I want to say to you that that's something you could unlearn and could be undone. Because if God is love and perfect love casts out fear, then there shouldn't be. When we explore our ideas of God and our own lives, we should not be left feeling fearful. And I'd be happy to chat about that too. If that's something you'd like to do, please be in touch and have a good week. Cheers.